This is Judge Joe Brown, and you're watching We All Be News TV, the
News-free Dixie.
News-free Dixie for the 21st century.
Okay, our next speaker is someone that is very, very familiar with a lot of us. We have seen him on TV with his court show, and I will say, every time you'd get upset, I'd get scared of you. I'd be like, why? I don't want to get up in front of a court. No, but I also found out through this entire series of events that he is also a master historian on Fort Pillow. So I would like to introduce everybody to Judge Joe Brown.
I think I can still get getting old, but I think I can still do that well. All right, I've got sort of a catch bag called Politics of the Situation. Now, where we are right here at this point in the Civil War is the Union had an overall strategic plan called the Anaconda Plan. They wanted to get control of the Mississippi River and then blockade the southern ports and constrict the South. The South was counting on securing aid from England and France on account of the desire of those two entities to get southern cotton. Fort Pillow was set up as a Confederate redoubt to control the Mississippi River. That's before Grant and the U.S. Navy basically opened it up to Union traffic. It was ideally situated to do that, but when it came to defending the position from a land-based assault, it was untenable. Grant actually ordered that Fort Pillow be shut down. General Sherman backed that up. There were some nefarious Union characters who were politically connected, medium-ranked officers who decided that they were going to engage in smuggling contraband cotton. So they secretly countermanded Union orders to close down Fort Pillow and kept it open so they could get the contraband cotton out. Strategically, that was harmful to the southern position because it allowed a direct market for their cotton to be opened up through Union faculties and cut down the opportunities for them to secure necessary military supplies, weapons, ammunition, clothing, equipment from Europe. Also, since Tennessee was pivotal to the Union effort and would ultimately produce such interesting set-tos as the Battle of Nashville, where colored volunteer troops played a big part, would become the ultimate base of operations for two very interesting raids by a Union cavalry commander known as Grierson, who would become the first commander of the 10th Cavalry after the war. They're known as the Buffalo Soldiers, along with the 9th Cavalry and some infantry units. Also, Grant at that point had suffered a setback and that ForREst and others had raided his supply lines that were going to go through inland Mississippi to support his investment of Vicksburg, which was crucial to the Anaconda Plan. Grant suffered a severe setback and lost a lot of supplies and equipment. He had by this point developed the idea that he was going to live off the land, which is something that his subordinate General Sherman did well when he marched through Georgia, took everything, burnt everything else he could, etc., etc. Now, there was an outpost known as Milliken's Bend that was in Arkansas. It had been manned to a great extent by colored volunteer troops, and Grant was pushing the front that Milliken's Bend was going to be vital to his supply line. It was not, but I'm sure that ForREst, being a Confederate cavalry commander, was quite privy to the strategic and tactical situation in the area. He had suffered a number of military setbacks in recent weeks prior to the Fort Pillow situation from some colored troops who had made some interesting stands and driven him off with significant casualties. Now, if you go downtown on the southeast corner, across from the civil courthouse is a historical plaque that notes that on that spot, ForREst and his business partner, Maples, who is the great-great-grandfather of a former president of the Memphis Patrolmen's Association, Police Association, Ray Maples. They operated the biggest slave trading business in the United States. Now, ForREst, it's interesting, it was touched upon after the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau did a study to see how the South was adapting and discovered that out of all of the South, ForREst was paying the highest wages to former slaves to be laborers. He felt that was a way to restore his financial circumstances. He was also, during the time of Fort Pillow, attempting to cement some future political, foundations in the state of Tennessee for after the war, however it turned out. So when you get this investment of the area around Fort Pillow, the Confederates have the high ground. There are Union troops in a very exposed, undefensible position running this bootleg operation wherein contraband cotton was being taken out of the South to be sold to France and England, the market that the South was depending upon to get their military supplies, and also using that as a pressure to attempt to get England and France to come in on their side in this Civil War. The Union by that time had invented the USS Monitor, a turreted gunship, and some follow-on vessels, and they were armed with 11 and 15-inch cannon that completely outclassed anything Britain had. Britain had made the determination that there was no way they were going to get involved in attempting to assist the South in breaking the so-called blockade because of the monitors. So they stayed away, even though they had what was ostensibly the most powerful navy in the world. At that time, Lincoln was suffering a very bad series of political downturns, basically due to the fact that incompetent generals like McClellan et al., otherwise commanding the Army of the Potomac, seemed to be unable to carry on a fight or take any initiative against Robert Lee and his boys, and it was becoming politically embarrassing. Well, he was beginning to note that Grant would fight, and there was a scandal that was going on where some of Grant's superiors were attempting to discredit him and saying he had slipped back into his old habits of drinking too much. Lincoln is famous for saying, well, I tell you what, you find out what kind of whiskey that general drinks, and you send every other general that I have a whole barrel of that. And let's see if we can get them to fight. Those political circumstances were not unknown to the South, and I would imagine that ForREst, being an astute individual, wanted to do something to destroy Mr. Lincoln's political circumstances as much as he could. So I think most every one of the writers that I have read on the Fort Pillow situation have been incredibly naive when it came to the overall political situation. They did not take these larger political circumstances into consideration in the books that they wrote, nor the research that they did. Napoleon understood it, Julius Caesar understood it, and a Prussian general named Clausewitz wrote a book called Von Krieg, that is on war. And he said war is but the ultimate extension of the political process. It's an interesting book, and some years ago I prescribed that book to some U.S. Army officers that I was acquainted with who had not read it. They were amazed and said, no wonder we could not win in Vietnam. And if you are familiar with Clausewitz, you will understand why such astute leaders as ForREst had to do something to cut off the political circumstances that Lincoln had gotten involved in and that his war represented. War is, in context, but an extension of the political process, and ForREst wanted to cut Lincoln off so that the Union would be found wanting in terms of his patience or ability to prosecute the war. Now, I'm concluding, but in the long-term politics, the Civil War was the first modern war in the world. They used telegraph communications, steam engines, mass production, and they used the railroads for quick transportation. Europe would have done well to have taken heed of the lessons of the American Civil War. What you have also is Grant came up with the form of warfare that the American military still uses. We can build more material than anybody else, and being a fairly large country, we generally have more people to sacrifice. In other words, we can afford to lose more troops than the other side and throw a lot of technology and material at them that they can't overcome. Grant started that. But it also showed something else that we saw in the Vietnam era, which is also apparent right now. We don't like to stay the course on something, and after it gets rough, after a few years, we want out. ForREst, I imagine, was counting on that kind of mindset that was widespread. There had been a number of riots in New York City and other urban areas wherein the Irish in particular did not wish to be conscripted to fight in this war. There were some very dire political circumstances, and I find it incredibly naive that the writers ignored this context when they evaluated what ForREst was doing. Politically, what was he doing? He was making it difficult to recruit colored volunteers. he was making it difficult to sustain the Union's position in Tennessee, which was one of the few locales where the Union Army was prevailing, and he was attempting to use psychological warfare against would-be colored volunteers. Further, there's this military principle that the commander is responsible for the conduct of his troops, and I would say that ForREst was very, very derelict in controlling his troops if he ever wanted to rely upon a position of they got out of control. He was in a position to view what was going on from the heights above the fort. He ignored what he saw, and I would submit that what he did, what happened at Fort Pillow, was exactly what Admiral Nelson did for the English. He was told in one famous sea battle to pull back and withdraw. He was being signaled to that. He was blind in one eye. He put his telescope to his blind eye, and he claimed he did not see the signal on purpose. And I would submit that ForREst claims he did not see what was going on purpose. And finally, by the end of the Civil War, when Congress was attempting to investigate this, they needed Tennessee to help restore the balance, and Tennessee was one of the crucial states to ratify the 14th Amendment. So they relied on Nathan Bedford ForREst, and he was restored to political graces after the war. I would suggest that some of the findings in the historic record have a lot to do with that. Thank you. That is my small part.